When I was in middle school, a new family moved in across the street, a couple with 2 young children. They were quiet, kept to themselves, and honestly seemed a little off. It didn't take long for us to notice that something just wasn't right. One day, the woman came over to apologize to my parents. She mentioned that her kids screamed and cried a lot, and she hoped it wasn't disturbing us. The strange part? None of us had ever heard anything. At the time, I remember thinking the whole interaction felt eerie. Not long after, my dad was home one afternoon when he heard the woman screaming from her backyard. He rushed over to find her standing there, hysterical, saying her youngest child was unresponsive. Police arrived, and tragically, the child was dead. That's when everything unraveled. Suddenly, the neighborhood turned into a crime scene. Police cars, unmarked vehicles, yellow tape. It was like something out of a movie. At first, the woman claimed the child had fallen and hit their head on the patio. But the investigation quickly revealed the horrifying truth. She had beaten the child to death and tried to stage it as an accident. As the case unfolded, even darker details came to light. The family had recently moved from another town, where they'd been repeatedly reported to Child Protective Services for abuse. Their reputation had followed them, and they were essentially forced to leave their old neighborhood. Somehow, they managed to slip through the cracks and start over in ours. It got even worse. During the murder investigation, it came out that the 2 children weren't even legally adopted. They had been purchased, a fact that shocked everyone. This all happened in the 1980s, long before the internet or background checks were common. Back then, it was much easier to hide skeletons in your closet. They'd only been living across from us for a few months before it all went down, but the damage they caused was immeasurable. To this day, it's one of the darkest, most chilling experiences of my life. What seemed like a quiet, odd family turned out to be hiding unspeakable horrors. When I was in 7th grade, I had this neighbor, middle-aged, early 40s, and one of those people who seemed nice on the surface but gave off a vibe that something wasn't quite right. My mom, being super patriotic, had decorated our house in red, white, and blue from top to bottom. It was kind of her thing. One day, walking home from school, I saw this guy sitting in his front yard. He waved me over and said he was having a red, white, and blue sale in his backyard and thought I'd be interested. At first, I just nodded and told him I needed to go home and grab some money. But the truth was, alarm bells were going off in my head. Something about it felt wrong. What adult has a backyard sale targeted at kids walking home from school? Instead of going home, I went to the house of my next-door neighbor. Now, this guy was intimidating. Mid-30s, built like a tank and covered in prison tattoos. But he had turned his life around. People around the neighborhood knew he was a good guy despite his tough exterior. I explained the situation to him, and without hesitation, he walked with me to the creepy neighbor's house. We went to the backyard, and sure enough, the man had set up an actual sale. There were random red, white, and blue items scattered around, a flag here, a cup there. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My neighbor didn't say much at the time, but his presence was enough to ensure nothing shady went down. After we left, he must have called the cops, because I later found out he also told my parents about the encounter. That explains why, from that point forward, they made me walk home on the other side of the street. Fast forward 2 years, and my gut feeling about that man turned out to be right. He was arrested for attempting to lure a child into his house. Recently, I reconnected with my tattooed neighbor on Facebook and asked if he remembered the incident. He did. He said the whole situation had seemed shady to him too, which is why he reported it immediately. He wasn't going to take any chances, especially with a kid involved. I'm so glad I trusted my instincts that day, and that I had someone like him in my corner. Sometimes, the people you least expect turn out to be your biggest protectors. I grew up in a rough neighborhood, the kind of place that shaped you fast. Whether for better or worse, I'm still not sure. Rough neighborhoods are funny like that, though. They divide people into categories pretty clearly. You've got your ghost neighbors, the ones who keep to themselves and might as well not exist. You've got your neighbors from hell, the ones who make you want to move every day. And then there are the good ones, the awesome neighbors you hold close because, in a place like that, you need them. On my street, things weren't so black and white. To the right of our house was a ghost neighbor who eventually warmed up and became a decent guy. To the left were my godparents, a solid and dependable presence. Across the street, though, that's where the chaos lived. A family of meth addicts. 2 doors down from them, on the corner, lived the man who ran the show. The guy everyone knew, the guy everyone feared, respected, or both. His name was Dan, or as the neighborhood called him, Tweaker Dan. Some called him the White Guy, though that sounded more like a title than an insult. Dan was a lot. He ran a makeshift auto shop out of his garage, hammering and grinding away at cars from 5 in the morning until midnight. His driveway was a revolving door of people coming to buy meth or hang out, if you can call it that. Sometimes there were loud arguments, sometimes there were gunfights, and most of the time, when Dan went for his gun, people knew better than to stick around. But here's the thing. Dan wasn't your typical drug dealer. Sure, he was loud and erratic, and he didn't exactly scream pillar of the community, but he was oddly friendly. He waved to everyone. Neighbors, strangers, anyone he recognized as part of the neighborhood got a wave. As a kid, I thought he was just trying to act like a nice guy. It wasn't until I got older that I realized those waves meant something entirely different. Dan wasn't just a small-time dealer. No, he was the supplier for the whole area. Our neighborhood sat smack in the middle of a neutral zone between 2 major gangs. It was the kind of place that could have easily become a battleground, but it didn't, because of Dan. See, Dan had rules. He sold to both gangs, but made it clear, you keep your shit out of my neighborhood. That wasn't a suggestion. It was a condition. If you wanted to deal with him, you didn't bring your drama, your beefs, or your business anywhere near his turf. That rule, it kept our streets safer than they should have been, considering what was going on all around us. And the waving, the bike rides? Dan wasn't just being friendly, he was keeping tabs. He wanted you to know he saw you. Whether you lived there or were just passing through, his wave was more than a greeting. It was a message. I'm watching you. As a kid, I didn't understand. I just thought he was a crazy meth head who never slept and liked to ride his bike everywhere. But when I got older, I started learning more about him. Stories from mutual friends, little details that painted a bigger picture. Dan wasn't just running his operation. He was running the neighborhood in his own way, keeping it under his version of control. The craziest part? Dan had friends in the most unlikely places. The prison guard down the street? Friends with Dan. The family 3 doors down who always kept their lawn immaculate? Friendly with Dan. My godfather? Also friends with him. It didn't make sense at first. Why would these respectable people associate with someone like Dan? When I finally asked my godfather, he shrugged and said, sometimes things are what they are. He wasn't perfect, but he kept the neighborhood from getting worse. Looking back, I can see it. Dan wasn't a hero, but he wasn't a monster either. He was a little bit of both. To the clean houses in the neighborhood, he was a villain, a cautionary tale. To the people who understood the bigger picture, he was a necessary evil, a guy who made sure the chaos stayed on his terms, not someone else's. So that's Tweaker Dan, the best and worst neighbor I ever had. A man who was equal parts menace and protector, who waved to you with one hand while keeping the other close to his gun. I can't say I miss him, but I'll never forget him.